Hello learners, welcome to the course MMPM 006 Marketing Research. I am Dr. Venkataya Chittipaka in the School of Management Studies, Indira Gandhi National Open University. You have already been introduced to the needs, scope and applications of marketing research. Further, you have also been introduced to research design, sampling design, data collection methods, scales of measurement and development of the questionnaires, etc. Now, in this session, I will introduce the concept of data preparation, which includes data editing, coding, and clarification. So, going forward here, as you know, the data preparation is a process of sorting and filtering the raw data to remove the unnecessary and inaccurate data points in the data that we collected. And further, the data collected for the purpose of this study itself cannot reveal anything and everything, right? So here, the raw data is required to be processed and analyzed in order to achieve the desired result. The data cannot be directly used for analysis. Before analysis, the data is required to be processed. Data processing is an intermediate stage between the data collection and analysis, interpretation, which includes checking the data and editing the data, coding the data, and tabulation of the data. So, the data processing is a crucial stage in the research. So, after collecting the data from the field, the researcher has to process and analyze them in order to arrive at certain conclusions which may confirm or invalidate the hypothesis which he had formulated towards the beginning of the research work. So, therefore, the data preparation, the data editing is one of the most important stage in the entire data collection process. And the mass of data collected during the field work will be processed to reduce it to the manageable proportions, because we collect several kinds of data from the market, and the same data can be edited and the same data can be processed through various stages as per the requirement of the research work, right? So here, only by such a careful and systematic processing, the data will lend itself to statistical treatment and meaningful interpretation and the conclusions. Then only we can get all sort of the meaningful interpretations. We can draw the meaningful interpretations after collecting the data and processing it in a more systematic approach. The processing of data includes, as you know, the editing of the data and coding of the data, classification of the data, and the tabulation of the data, because we collect the data. After collecting the data, because that is a raw form of data we collect generally, so after collecting the data, it is the required to edit and also give the coding and also classify it and also tabulate it, so that this actually gives you the meaningful information. Because as a researcher, we need to take utmost care while processing the entire raw data in the form of editing, in the form of coding, in the form of classification, and also the tabulation, because the coding gives us a clear insights all about the type of data that you have collected, and after that you classify it, right? Going forward here, the collected data should be organized so that the table charts can be prepared for the presentation, right? As you know that when we are trying to edit the data that we collected, we separate them in the form of the codings. We give the codings, so we also classify it, and also we put it in the form of a tabulation, right? So the same can be organized so that the table charts can be prepared for the presentation. That's how the the researchers are going to get the more insights all about the data that is being collected from the market. So based on that, we can draw the conclusions, we can draw the interpretations, and based on that we can also suggest other kind of the implications, what exactly the research is going to be, right? So the processing of data is necessary because the data collected should be examined and the errors and the mistakes are rectified, so that at the stage of analysis of data, no difficulty is experienced. So this is how the processing of data is essential. When the data is after collecting the data, it need to be examined carefully, and the errors need to be rectified, and so that at the stages of the analysis of data, no difficulty is going to be experienced. Otherwise all the efforts are going to be wasted if you do not follow a certain kind of the or the editing and then coding and the classification it is. Therefore, there are various steps involved in the processing of data, that includes editing of the data and then coding of the data and then classification of the data and then tabulation of the data. That's how in this session I am going to give you more insights all about, to make you understand, you as a researcher, how to edit the data and how you give the codings to the data, and then how do you classify the data, right? So today in this session we more focus on these three things: editing, coding and the classification of the data. Now let's focus more on understanding what is editing in the data, right? So how you as a researcher should more focus on the editing of the data, and what is the importance of this editing, right? For example, as I said, to understand more about the editing, editing means to rectify or to set, to order or to correct or to establish the sequence. Because let's say you have collected the data and data is there with you, the raw data, I can say you have collected some 500 samples from the marketplace, and then you have to arrange, you have to understand the kind of the insights that you are going to get out of the data that you have collected as a researcher, because with a purpose you have collected it, right? So here editing plays a major role when understanding the gamut of the raw data that you have collected, right? So that the views expressed by the participants, the respondents, you can easily understand, right? Therefore, editing means here to rectify or to set to order or to correct or to establish the sequence, how this is going to benefit for your research, right? And editing is the process of examining the collected data in a questionnaire or the interview schedule, to deduct errors and omissions and to correct those if possible. Because this is all about, as I said, we after collecting the data from the field, right, as a scholar, as a researcher, we need to examine that data, right? Because we collect it through the questionnaires. We collect it through the questionnaires, and we need to examine after collecting the data, right? Maybe or with the with the help of the interviews schedules that you have conducted, so that what we are going to do in this process, you are going to deduct the errors and omissions and to correct those if possible, right? This is how we are going to work on while going to edit on the data, right? So when the whole data is collection is over, a final and thorough checkup is made for the data processing. Because in the field it is difficult actually to get all the responses in the stipulated time periods, because looking at the respondents time schedules, looking at their availability, normally as a scholar we try more number of times to visit them and to educate them, or to create certain kind of the awareness about the importance of the data that we collect them. It's going to useful for the research that we collect, we are going to carry out, right? So when the whole data collection is over, a final and thorough checkup is made for the data processing, and it is better if the data collected is verified even before the data analysis is carried out, right? This is how normally as a scholar has to ensure that always the collected data is to be verified even before the data analysis is carried out, right? So editing is the first step in this process. So editing ensures that the collected data are accurate and consistent with the other facts gathered uniformly and as completely as possible. That's how the editing plays a vital role in the entire the data collection process, because it ensures the collected data is going to be accurate and consistent with the other facts gathered uniformly as completely as possible. Otherwise, what happens? Certain kind of fields are going to be left over again. It's going to have its implications on the final output, right? So I will throw more light on this missing values maybe in the next session. So here today only we focus mostly on the editing part, because editing is the first step in the entire process of the data after collecting the data collection, because it ensures that the collected data is all about are accurate and the consistent with other facts gathered uniformly and as completely as possible. For example, imagine if we get the newspaper unedited, how does the newspaper looks like? Can we imagine that? Because look at you are reading a newspaper, either Hindi or English or any kind of language in which you are interested or comfortable. Imagine a news item which is unedited being published. Can you imagine how is it going to be a kind of the meaningful information or not? Similarly, an unedited film will have no sequence of events, which means the story cannot be understood at all, right? So this is how the editing plays a vital role in the entire the data collection. After once the data collection process is over, this is the first step to understand the data, because here while we are working on this editing part, we try to understand the behavior of the data, how actually it has come, so that you are going to understand it correctly. You are going to put it in the form of a more sequential manner, because that's how the newspapers are being edited, and the edited newspapers are going to be published to the readers, so that we can easily understand what is there on the newspaper. That like headlines, how the headlines are being organized in a newspaper, and how the subheadings are being organized in a newspaper. And also you just can imagine that in a newspaper, the type of news is being printed on the first page and the second page, inside the third page, for like this the sequence it is, right? So editing is the major step to put the entire data which is collected in a more sequential manner, right? So here, going forward to understand more about the data editing, because the data editing is done to ensure ensure the accuracy of the data collected, because we get the data, as I said, with the example of a newspaper or unedited the movie, right? Because you do not understand anything meaningful, right, when the unedited movie is being released, if you are happen to uh, if you happen to watch that movie, right? So it's all about the editing is done to ensure the accuracy of the data collected, number one. And number two, for the consistency between the responses collected, actually, because let's say if you have collected the data, as I said, some 500 responses from the field, and as a scholar, you should also know the sequence, you should also know the arrangement of the data that you have collected, so that it gives you the kind of the meaningful information. Otherwise, again, it's all about the waste of the efforts that you've been carried out, right? And also to ensure the uniformity of the data, because for example, if the questionnaire is being divided into two segments, one is part A consisting of the demographics, part B consisting of your core research questions, and there is a relevance between the part A and part B, because as a scholar we always try to establish the connection between the demographics, with respect to the research questions that you are trying to understand, that you are trying to, come up with a kind of, the outcome, right? So always, we always going to check the uniformity, right, of the, kind of, the responses while, editing, and then for completeness in responses even, right? Because suppose if a respondent didn't find the time or responded with all the questions that you have put in the questionnaire, so what happens? You are going to be clueless actually, because the outcome is going to have its own kind of, the errors you are going to encounter, right? So at the same time, the editing is also done to ensure for completeness in the response, and to facilitate and simplify the coding and the tabulation, right? So this is how the data editing is going to be carried out, and to better utilize the questions answered out of the order, right? This is how the data editing is done to ensure the entire, the data what we have collected, right? So now let us see the types of editing. Let us try to understand what are the various types of editing that we could see as a part of this session, because so far we have understood all about the importance of the editing actually, right? So why do we edit, right? And what are the various the stages involved in the editing process. Now let us try to understand the types of editing, right? Because as you know that editing is performed at two stages, and depending on that, it could be of two types. So the first type can be the field editing, and the second type can be the central editing or the centralized editing, right? These are the two types of editing here, the field editing and the central editing or the centralized editing. Now let us try to understand more about what is this field editing and what is this central editing, right? So if you look at the field editing is a type of editing which relates to abbreviated or illegible written forms of gathered data. So here, uh, this field editing is always concerned about the illegible written forms of gathered data, because sometimes what happens, the questions by mistake, the researcher must have written not in a more uniform way, so that as a result of that, it won't it won't yield any kind of the meaningful statement, right? So this illegible written forms are going to mislead the respondent to respond in a wrong way, right? So such editing is more effective when done on the same day or the very next day after the interview, right? So the investigator must not jump to conclusions while doing the field editing, right? This is how we can try to understand what exactly this field editing. And the second type of editing is that the central editing it is. So central editing relates to the time when all data collection processes have been completed. Here, a single or a common editor corrects errors like entry in the wrong place or entry in the wrong unit, etc. So, as a rule, all the wrong answers should be dropped from the final results. This is how the central editing can take place. The first one is the field editing. The field editing is all about relating to abbreviated or illegible written forms of the gathering data. Therefore, this type of editing is more effective when done on the same day or the very next day after the interview itself. And whereas the central editing relates to the time when all data collection processes have been completed, and here a single or common editor corrects errors like entry in the wrong place, entry in the wrong unit, etc. As a rule, all the wrong answers should be dropped from all the final results. Right. Now, let's try to understand what kind of the considerations that we consider while editing, right? So here the considerations, like the editor must be familiar with the interviewer's mindset, objectives, and everything related to the study, right? Because the role of editor plays a vital role here, because the editor must have the sound understanding of the particular, the area of research, and at the same time the interviewer's mindset and the objectives and everything related to the study. Then only he can, the editor can, justify while doing the editing of the whole content, or in the whole, the research work, right? So here, while doing the editing part, actually editors are going to use the different colors, because the different colors should be used when the editors make the entries in the data collected. Because otherwise, what happens, as per my convenience, if I start as an editor, if I start editing, then definitely it leads to certain kind of, the confusions to the person who is going to read it, even after, after, some time, also even later, right? So they should initially, they should initial all answers or changes they make to the data, actually. Because when we are going to check all the questionnaires, right, when you are going to try to edit the entire data set that you have, gathered from the field, right, while doing it, while you are, doing the editing process, then we have to, put our initials, on all the answers or changes they make to the data set, actually. Because that gives some kind of, the clear mindset, to the scholars, that yes, there is a mistake, and this should must have, removed it, or some kind of comments should be, written, with the help of all your initials, all the, editors, the initials, right? So the editor's name and the date of editing should be placed on the data sheet, so that what happens, it can be understood easily that yes, this particular uh, data set is being, edited properly and checked properly, and all the mistakes are being, identified properly. This is how the editing requires some kind of, the careful considerations, right? Number one, the editor must be, must have sound understanding of the kind of study that is being carried out, and also try to understand the interviewer's mindset and the objectives, everything related to the study. This is how the, kind of, the considerations normally we carry out when we are going to do it, right? This is how we can try to understand the editing part, right? So here there are two types of editing. What we have seen, we have understood all about what is editing, what is editing process, what are the various types of, the editing, right? And what are the points to be, considered while going to edit, right? So this is how. Now going forward, the next one is the most important thing, is the coding part, actually, right? So here, after the data editing is done, right, so next stage is the coding part, actually. Coding is the process of organizing the whole data or the response into classes or categories, and assigning them some, numerical values or the symbols to responses according to the class or category in which they fall. This is how, what as a scholar, right, what we do is that we do the coding, right? So coding plays a vital role, actually. So here, coding is all about the process of organizing the data or response into the classes or categories, and assigning the numerical or the symbols to responses according to the class or category in which they fall. And the classification of the responses may be done on the basis of one or more common concepts, right? Because how do you, give the coding to the whole data? Because we classify them into, let's say, as I said earlier, if a questionnaire is consisting of, the part A, talking about dealing with the, demographics, part B is dealing with the core research questions. So we first uh, work on the demographic values and then move on to the core research questions. This is how we, depending on the requirement, we classify it, right? Because suppose for example, in a research, age factor, demographic factors like age, income, right, or educational qualifications, or the gender plays a vital role, then the researchers are going to classify the data as per the requirement, age wise data, right, and then gender wise data, or income wise data, or educational qualification wise data, right? This is how the classifications can be done. In coding, a particular numeral or a symbol is assigned to the answers in order to put the responses in some definite categories or the classes, because numbers, for example, while we are going to design the questionnaire itself, in the questionnaire, when you are going to put a question like, uh, what is the gender, right? What is your gender, right? Gender, male can be given as 1, female can be given as 2, like this. Income levels, I thought, you are going to give the income brackets like, 1,000, it's a range, let us say 1,000 to 5,000 rupees is another range, 5,000 to 10,000 rupees another range. Like this, you are giving some kind of the symbols or the numbers to each one when we are going to give the coding, because this coding helps directly entering the data into the Excel sheet or the worksheet, so that we can convert the qualitative information into the quantitative information. This is the role of coding actually. Coding actually helps the scholar to convert the data from the qualitative to the quantitative, right? So the classes of responses determined by the researcher should be appropriate and suitable to the study, right? This is how the coding is going to be done. And the coding enables efficient and effective analysis, as the responses are categorized into meaningful classes, right? And the coding decisions are considered while developing or designing the questionnaire or any other data collection tool. That's how the coding decisions are considered while developing or designing the questionnaire or any other data collection tool. This is how the coding plays a vital role, because as a scholar, when you are going to uh, develop or design a questionnaire, you are also going to keep in your mind the coding part actually, because this coding part actually the interface between the conversion of qualitative information into a quantitative information, because the same codes straight goes into your Excel worksheets or the SPSS worksheets, so that may be more useful in understanding the data in the form of the numbers, and subsequently we can apply the relevant kind of statistical techniques. And further, coding can be done manually or through the computer also. Nowadays we are, majority of the people are more acquainted with the technology, so we are using the computers to generate the codes also as per the requirement, right? And going forward, the last one, the classification to understand. So here the classification of the data implies that the collected raw data is categorized into a common group having a common feature, because we have seen the editing part, we have also seen the coding part, right? And we are now focusing on understanding what is a classification, right? So classification of the data implies that the collected raw data is categorized into a common group having a common feature. So here the data having common characteristics are placed in a common group. For example, uh, we are more concerned about the, let's say, the kind of demographic informations, right, like age and the income or the gender, right, the education. Like this, we classify them into various characteristics, right? we classify them into various characteristics and then we put them, right? This is related to the demographic information. For example, if you're concerned about a core research, right? So your, let's say your study is consisting of mainly designed with the help of, for example, in a supply chain management area, there is a model framework called, the TOE, technology, and then organizational, and then environmental factors. Technology factors are differently classified, and then organizational factors are differently classified, and environment factors are differently classified, because the data having a common characteristics are placed in a common group. This is how a researcher is going to classify the whole data, and the entire data collected is categorized into various groups or classes which convey meaning to the researcher, right? So the classification is done in two ways. The first one is the classification according to attributes, classification according to the class intervals. And classification, now let's try to understand quickly classification according the attributes. Classification according to the attributes, because here the data is classified on the basis of common characteristics that can be descriptive, like literacy, sex, honesty, marital status, etc., or numericals like weight, height, income, etc. And the descriptive features are qualitative in nature and cannot be measured quantitatively, but are kindly considered while making an analysis. And analysis is used for such classified data is known as the statistics of attributes, and the classification is known as the classification according to the attributes. This is how we can broadly understand the classification according to the attributes. Now, moving to understand the classification on the basis of the interval. So here, the numerical feature of data can be measured quantitatively and analyzed with the help of some statistical units, like the data relating to income, production, age, weight, etc., come under this category. This type of data is known as statistics of variables, and the data is classified by way of intervals, right? So the classification according to the class interval usually involves the following three main problems. So number one is the number of classes, and the second point is the how to select the class limits, and how to determine the frequency of each class, right? Because otherwise, if you do not set proper intervals, again there is a there is a problem to get a kind of the errors in the data that we are going to collect, right? So this is how we can try to understand the classification of the data, and this is the end of today's session. Thank you.